Okay. I'm Dr. William Behan. I am Bishop of the Apostolic Johannite Church. I'm also a lecturer in philosophy at the Pennsylvania State University. And this is actually one of the instances where my professional life and my ecclesiastical life really come together, because I'm going to be talking today about Jakob Böhme. And Böhme has a profound influence on many of the philosophical figures that I work with in my scholarly life. So he's also, of course, one of the saints of the Apostolic Johannite Church. And so it behooves us to learn a little bit about what these people stand for, what they were writing about, and why they're significant for our tradition. What I'm going to do is just give I'm going to skip most of the biographical information. This is about as detailed as the biographical information is going to get, because we can find biographical information on Böhme anywhere. You can look it up on Wikipedia, and so it won't be a problem. But what I want to do is look at, first of all, the significance of the philosophical and religious milieu from which he comes has for our tradition, and then also look at some of two of the key issues in his theology. Jakob Böhme was born April 24th, 1575, died in November 17th, 1624. He was born at Seidenberg in eastern Germany near Görlitz, and he lived most of his life in Görlitz. He comes from the Lutheran tradition of Christian mysticism. And within the Apostolic Johannite Church, there's often a tendency to denigrate or to put to the side some of the Protestant elements that we either find distasteful or don't accord with our particular theology. But it's interesting because at the time when Böhme is writing and doing his work, there is a much more of a link or a parallel between the Protestant theological school and what we would consider Gnosticism. First of all, the emphasis on personal inspiration, personal union with God, the personal conversation with God. And we see this, for example, in the influence that early Lutheranism has on pietism, on the Quietist movements. And I think that it's important for us to recognize that as modern Gnostics, we draw not only from the Orthodox and Catholic traditions, not only from the classical Gnostic traditions, not only from the Neoplatonic traditions, but also from the traditions of the Reformation. And Böhme is very much part of this Reformation theology. So the way that Böhme is thinking of Lutheranism is actually exactly the place where Gnostic kind of thinking would be appropriate, where it would rise up. In terms of his ideas, and that's really what I want to focus on here rather than biographical or historical elements, there are two ideas that I think are central to Böhme's theology, both of which I think really have a place in our thinking about divinity, about freedom, about sin, and about evil. And these are the key ideas, the key sort of cluster of concepts with which Böhme is dealing. So the first is his emanationist theology. And this is where, in some sense, Böhme is both most radical and most influential, because he has the idea that everything emerges from a single source, and he calls that source the Ungrund, the ungrounded, the abyss. There's something that is absolutely inscrutable, absolutely beyond human comprehension. And it is itself something that is deep. It's something that is almost lacking. It's something that longs. And this is what typifies this Ungrund, this longing, this desire, this wanting. And this stands in stark opposition to most traditional metaphysical and theological notions of the ultimate source of divinity, where divinity is seen in its primal state as fullness, as the plenitude, as having everything and therefore lacking nothing. In fact, in many theological traditions, it's important that we acknowledge that Godhead lacks nothing and that our practices do not contribute to God. They don't better God. God doesn't change as a result of our actions. But Böhme takes precisely the opposite direction, that the original source of all things is lack. It's nothing. And it is this desire that gives rise to the universe. In some sense, he's drawing on a much older tradition. We can see something very, very similar in Aristotle, where Aristotle looks to the prime mover, that which moves all things without itself being moved. And that is moving things as a result of desire, of want, of lack. So Böhme is introducing a notion of Godhead that is historical, that is developmental, that changes over time. So God is not something that simply is what he is at all times and in all places and in all forms, possesses all qualities and is perfection. But instead the ultimate root of Godhead is want, is desire. So the Ungrund is this first person of the Trinity. Because Böhme is working within a Trinitarian context. He is working within a more or less traditional context. So the first figure of divinity, the Father, is lack. It does nothing but want. It doesn't want anything in particular. It doesn't desire any object because there are no objects for it to desire. There is nothing but itself. And it's this isolation, it is this unity that causes it to desire. And its desire then becomes the second person of the Trinity. So the Son is associated not with the Ungrund itself, but with the desire of the Ungrund, the want of the Ungrund. And that want then shows itself, he says, as in a mirror. And that mirror is the third aspect of the Trinity. So we have Father, Son, Spirit, but in a very, very different way than we're used to in traditional theology. We have something that is abyssal. It is a void. And that void desires. And that desire is then reflected. And in that reflection, we have the source of all things. Why is this important for Gnostic theology? Why is this important for Gnosticism? Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it puts God in a very, very different context. It puts God in the category of desire. And so when we look at our own desires, we look at our own lack, we look at our own wants, we're not comparing ourselves to God in a sense that we are therefore inferior, we are damaged, we are in need of reparation, but rather it is precisely in our want, precisely in our lack, that we reflect the divinity of the primal source. And so we often have a tendency to think of ourselves as seekers, as students, as philosophers in the traditional sense of the word. That is to say, lovers of wisdom, those who pursue wisdom. Plato is very, very clear in the Symposium that the philosopher is never the one who has wisdom, but neither is the philosopher the one who is completely devoid of wisdom. The philosopher is always in the middle, and we find ourselves in the same place. We're smart enough to realize that we lack something, but it's precisely in that lack that we show our love for wisdom. And that lack is a reflection of divinity. So this lack, this desire, and this mirror show themselves within the human being. And our search for fullness, our search